Hello Team AA. We're going to look at substantive audit procedures, one that does tend to stress audit and assurance candidates more than some of the other areas of the syllabus. It's important to remember that there are going to be some challenging areas of the syllabus and avoiding them is not the best idea. So stop sticking your head in the sand and actually start facing your fears and your concerns for this syllabus head on as early as possible so that you can give yourself plenty of time to prepare properly. Make sure when you are studying, particularly when you are studying looking at a very challenging area, one that's going to worry you a little bit more or might need a bit more energy, it's important to make sure everything else around you is comfortable. So make sure that you are mentally and physically ready. So, making sure you are looking after yourself throughout this study process, getting plenty of sleep, eating well. And then when you are looking at a more challenging area, making sure that you've got a clear space around you, you're somewhere comfortable, somewhere that makes you happy, just so that then that will help you feel much more prepared when you're looking at this. The other thing that's important to think about when you are looking at the more challenging areas is how much time you should be spending studying at a time. So little and often is a good idea. It makes it less daunting rather than saying that I'm going to try and tackle the entire session and look at everything relating to substantive audit procedures in one hit. By breaking it down maybe into smaller bite-sized chunks so that you're doing smaller sessions and then going and having a break or doing something different or maybe coming back to it on another day will just make it easier for you to absorb it and make it less overwhelming, but also it will help you retain this information better, which is really important because by the time you're looking at audit procedures, you know that you've already looked at quite a lot of the audit process, and so you'll be getting a feel for how many things you need to try and remember for this exam. So, the one that's feared by many, audit procedures. We're going to have a look at an overview, making sure that you can think about the key things to remember when you are trying to answer questions on this area. Let's take a look. One of the most challenging areas of the syllabus is those substantive audit procedures. They may be tricky, but you cannot escape them, as this area often turns up in both sections and will be in your exam. The main challenge is that this is a practical area. It is something that the auditor does when out at the client, and imagining that process can be hard, especially if you do not have that much experience in audit. The other challenge is the amount you need to know for this area. You need your knowledge from audit evidence as well as audit procedures to ensure that you can tackle this properly. Rote learning tests is not enough to get a pass here. There are quite a few things that can come up in your exam. As you can see from the mind map on screen, gathering evidence knowledge is needed. You'll also need to be able to understand the auditor's approach to managing this area of the audit process, which I'll go through in a moment. You can then look practically at the balances that you might see in the exam. You could be tested on balances both across the statement of profit and loss and the statement of financial position. So preparing for balances such as revenue, costs such as wages and salaries, assets, liabilities, share capital is important. In addition to this, you may also be examined on disclosures, for example, looking at potential contingent liabilities or assets. Estimates in the financial statements are always more challenging to audit, and so you need to ensure that you adopt specific procedures, such as analytical procedures, which will help identify potential misstatements. Smaller entities and not-for-profit organisations can also come up in your exam as they are in your syllabus, and they test whether you know what procedures are more suitable for these entities. Remember that there will be less resources in organisations like this, so less reliance on controls, and take care to read about how they are structured. Analytical procedures will again help here. Evidence needs to be gathered to ensure we reach the correct conclusions of the financial statements. ISA 500 tells us that evidence needs to be sufficient and appropriate. Sufficient means enough, so depending on the balance or the issue will depend on how much that is, and this is always a matter for auditor judgment. Appropriate means it has to be relevant and reliable. Relevant to the objective being achieved. If it is a substantive audit procedure, this means that it has to verify at least one assertion. Reliable evidence is also important. Remember the auditor wish list. Wherever possible, they would want third-party, original, documented and directly obtained evidence. If this cannot be obtained, then more evidence may need to be gathered to feel satisfied with their conclusions. The aim of a substantive audit procedure is to test and identify material misstatements. They are designed to ensure the auditor considers whether any adjustment is needed for the financial statements to show a true and fair view. This is evidence being gathered to help form an audit opinion. There are two types of procedure, a test of detail and an analytical procedure. Tests of detail are procedures such as inspecting, inquiring, recalculating, and confirming. Analytical procedures are comparing numbers and other information to identify anything unusual which could result in a material misstatement. These are different from tests of control, whose aim is identifying whether a control is working effectively. Make sure you do not confuse the two in the exam, or else you will miss out on valuable marks, as the requirement is always to ask specifically for a substantive audit procedure or a test of control. You may also need to inspect and inquire with tests of control, along with observe and reperform. This will be to confirm processes happen and not to review numbers in the financial statements. The assertions are needed to ensure you are designing the most appropriate audit procedures. You should be able to remember them all and explain what each one is, even if it's in a simple sentence. This will also help you decide which assertions are most appropriate for the balance that you're being asked about. For transactions and events, the focus is more on occurrence, classification, and cutoff. For account balances, rights and obligations, valuation and allocation, and existence are priorities. However, remember that completeness, accuracy, and presentation is appropriate for everything. Here is the auditor's approach to substantive audit procedures. It's a step-by-step approach to help you visualize what the auditor needs to do at this stage of the audit process. First, they identify the balance that they are reviewing and the most appropriate assertions to focus on. For example, they could be looking at receivables and identify rights and obligations, completeness, existence, and accuracy as priority assertions. They can then use this information to design their test. Remember, this test or procedure would be something to instruct an audit team member to carry out, and so it needs to have enough clear description to ensure someone can go off and do that work. Once tests are designed, they then need to think about the sample of transactions that they're going to test. How many and what method that they should actually use. Should they use a statistical method, such as random number tables, or systematic selection, or a non-statistical method, such as haphazard or block method? They also need to consider sampling risk to determine the correct method and volume of transactions that they're going to review. Then comes the practical work. The auditor will then perform the test, but evidence should also be collected, and so that test, the method, the evidence obtained should all be documented in the audit file. This will help when making conclusions on what has been gathered. It may be that many misstatements were found, and this might lead the auditor to decide to extend the sample and maybe test more transactions. There may be material misstatements found, in which case they may need to speak to the client more urgently. Or no issues may have been found at all, and therefore no further work is needed. However, this needs to be documented so it can be reviewed by the audit supervisor or manager so that they are reacting correctly to what's been going on. When in the exam, a structured approach will also be needed. As I mentioned before, rote learning procedures on their own will not help. You need to absorb the scenario information and use it to decide on what evidence that you can collect and therefore what procedures you need to collect it. For example, if they tell you in the scenario that the client has said no to circularisation letters, then you cannot design a test to send circularisation letters out, or else you'll gain no marks. Likewise, if they tell you that income is cash-based and received when goods are sold, cut-off procedures won't really work for revenue. So you need to know your client. Know the client that you're reviewing in the scenario, just like the audit team will need to know the client that they are auditing in the real world. The structure of your procedure will need to be a clear instruction. It will need to be an action such as inspect, recalculate, review, but definitely not check. Avoid that word as it doesn't really tell the marker what you are checking. You will also need a source. What is it that they are actually looking at? Are they comparing two things, such as the invoice to the ledger? Make sure you explain this in your procedure clearly. And then you will also need to ensure that the reason for doing this procedure is also clear. You can include an assertion, or you can just explain why these procedures would happen in your own words. With a clearly described audit procedure which relates to the scenario information, you will get 1 mark. Practice is needed to perfect these and improve your confidence in what you are designing, so keep persisting in this area.